just to kind of back up, review a little bit of what we did on Wednesday. This is again a review of the last test, really. The relationship between different technical factors and the equipment that we're going to talk about later in the semester, and some in this section. KBP is directly related to exposure. It's exponentially proportional. It's a 15% increase in KBP, doubles the exposure to the image receptor. MA is directly proportional in or mass is directly proportional in every way, regardless of whether it's MA or time. So both are directly proportional. Changes in KBP without changing mass increases X-ray production exponentially, so emission exponentially. That increases patient exposure dramatically, very dramatically, while increasing penetration. So again, you're going to have a tendency to kind of make connections that you need not to. If you change KVP, then your patient dose does indeed go up. We tend to lock into high KVP, low patient exposure, but that only holds true whenever you increase your KVP and you decrease your mass. So if the only thing that you increase is your KVP, then your patient dose actually increases, and it's pretty dramatic. But whenever we increase our KVP by 15%, decrease our mass by a factor of 2, then what we get is a lower patient dose. It's not half of the patient dose like what it would suggest if you cut the mass in half all by itself, but it is a lower dose than low KVP high mass techniques. So that increases the photons in the remnant beam whenever we increase KVP without changing our mass. That results in an exponential increase in image receptor exposure. Results on the image are really not much, because a computer algorithm takes care of all that. And your indication that you overexpose the patient or underexpose the patient is your index number, so your S number or whatever it is that you use. So with changing mass, the changing in KVP increases the production, but the reduction of mass brings it back down. So you increase your KVP, you reduce your mass, and it decreases patient dose pretty dramatically, not as dramatically as just decreasing one or the other, but it does decrease it fairly dramatically. But it results in the same image receptor exposure, and the results on the image again are not so much. So we talked about tissue and different tissue types, tissue thickness. Whenever we have an increase in tissue thickness, and if you remember from Wednesday, we talked about not confusing the effects of scatter radiation as tissue thickness increases and its effect on the image receptor. So if we increase thickness, we increase patient absorption, so patient dose goes up. Decreases transmission, and it's inversely proportional, so as patient thickness goes up, transmission decreases, and it decreases the exposure on the image receptor, and it's also inversely proportional. So what we use is mass to compensate for increases in tissue thicknesses, because if we increase KVP, we increase scatter radiation, and with tissue thickness, we increase scatter radiation as well. So we don't want to compound the problem, or compound the problem. So tissue density in image receptor exposure, we have an increase in patient absorption. Same, really everything is pretty much the same. The difference between thickness and density is that where we have an increase in thickness, the thickness being soft tissue primarily. If we have an increase in density, then the same holds true in that we decrease transmission, inversely proportional, and image receptor interaction the same. And we need to increase our mass in most cases, but the difference is that with the increase in density, what we get in a lot of cases is an increase in contrast. Okay, so with the increase in tissue thickness, in a lot of cases, what we get is an increase in scatter radiation. With increase in density, we get an increase in differential absorption, and we can actually see the tissue types better. Same with atomic number. More dramatically with atomic number, that's your ZEF number. So, you know, if we have an increase, a dramatic increase in bony tissue, for whatever reason, we're going to have an increase in contrast there as well, but everything else kind of follows the same, with the exception of KBP in the event that we need more penetration. So if our ZEF number increases dramatically enough that we need to increase penetration because it's just absorbing so much, and there are some pathological conditions where bone actually gets so dense that you can't really, you know, it's tough to penetrate. Maybe not on the same level as barium, but it's still very difficult to penetrate. So in those cases, you would increase KBP. Wet plaster, you would increase KBP. Otherwise, you're just going to have to increase mass so dramatically. It's kind of hard on the machine. So other equipment issues, as we increase filtration, we decrease the numbers. Okay, so filtration is that thing that's so confusing. It increases the average. Anything that increases the average theoretically would decrease contrast because a greater percentage of the X-ray beam penetrates through the patient, right? But at the same time, it decreases image receptor exposure, so we have to increase mass in order to compensate for that. If we use a grid, what's a grid supposed to do? We use a grid post-patient to absorb scatter radiations created inside of the patient, right? So what we'll talk about whenever we get to grids is that different grid construction requires different levels of change in technique in order to compensate for those. So they remove scatter radiation. Scatter radiation is, it lays down a layer of fog, and fog is a layer of unwanted density, but it's still density, right? So if your S number or your index number indicates that you properly exposed the patient without a grid, and then you introduce a grid, then what's your S number going to tell you? What's that? Underexposed. They were underexposed. So it's going to absorb some of that radiation that the image receptor needs in order to make its analysis of whether or not it got the proper amount of radiation, right? So if the grid absorbs some of that scatter radiation or removes some of that fog, fog is density, right? So remove some of that density, and it's going to indicate that you underexposed the patient. So what we need to do is increase mass to compensate for grid use. Well, why don't we use KBP? More scattered, right? And the purpose for the grid is to absorb scatter, right? So we talked about SID. As we increase SID, then our numbers decrease exponentially because of the inverse square law. So we need to increase mass according to the direct square law in order to compensate. And we talked about OID, increasing OID. The numbers are slight. You know, again, that's what we call the air gap, and it's just, you know, the textbook says it works kind of like a low ratio grid. And when we're talking about low ratio grids, the numbers, what those numbers represent is the effectiveness of the grid, essentially. So an 8-to-1 grid is pretty effective. A 10-to-1 grid is more effective. A 12-to-1 grid is even more effective, right? So when we're talking about a low ratio grid, we're talking about something like a 2 or a 3-to-1. So very, very low ratio grid that really doesn't do just a whole lot for you. So the air gap, and this is my personal opinion, the air gap is a little overstressed. You know, it just doesn't really remove all that much scatter radiation. So we'll talk about contrast. Contrast being the difference between black and white, and it's the ability to record the minute differences in density. Now, you've all kind of grown up with computers, right? And you've seen the different levels of resolution and also bit depth, right? So the first computers and TV screens that you might have seen might have looked pretty good, right? for the time, but then you get the next level that has a deeper bit depth and better resolution, and it looks better, and then you get to high resolution, and then you get to, you know, ultra HD and all these things that we've got now. It just looks like you can walk into your TV. So we've got a couple of different things going on there. Really, in comparison to contrast, bit depth, and the ability to record minute differences is really the bit depth, more so than the resolution. The resolution is just that, it's your sharpness of the image, as opposed to the bit depth is how many different shades of gray that you can record. Okay, so the higher the bit depth, the more shades of gray that you can record. If you have high contrast, it's very obvious differences. If you have low contrast, it's not so obvious, but yet at the same time with that great bit depth, then it makes those contrast levels not only available to you, but you can see those minute differences. So you got to have a balance between high contrast and low contrast. You can't have just one or the other. You got to be somewhere in between them. And we'll take a look at some images here in a second just to kind of drive that home. So the radiographic contrast is a product of the image receptor, and by this I mean the image receptor system, really, including the lookup table, including the monitor, including the actual image receptor that receives radiation. So it's really the entire system. So we've got that, and then we've got subject contrast. So if all your tissues were of the same density, of the same Zeph number, of the same thickness, then we'd have no contrast, right? And at the same time, if our image receptors couldn't ferret out those differences, then we'd also have no contrast. So we have to have both of those. So our radiographic contrast, what we see on the screen, is a product of those two things. We have to have a system that can record and display those different levels of density. And at the same time, we have to have differential absorption inside of the patient. Differential absorption is again dependent on the tissue types: bone, soft tissue, hair, radiographic contrast even. So in the IR contrast, mainly the lookup table, and then the subject contrast is your thickness, your density, and your atomic number, your Zeph number of the tissue types. So contrast. You're looking at, you know, these three images, and you know, in a radiographic image, we tend to look at something that's high contrast and is pleasing to the eye. And that's a radiographic image, because what we think of when we think of X-rays is primarily bone, right? So it's pleasing to the eye to see a high contrast X-ray image, but we don't want to see high contrast on everything. If we see high contrast on a chest X-ray, then what we've essentially got is an area of apparent high patient density in the ribs, right? But what are we looking for? Are we looking for ribs in a chest X-ray? No, so we want to see on top of those ribs or behind them, depending on if we're looking at anterior or posterior ribs. We want to see the lung markings, right? So we have to have a lower contrast as opposed to a ribs series. We want to see higher contrast. So in an X-ray, just like a photograph, high contrast is, you know, if we can get to a contrast level that's too high, and we can lose some information. And you can't really see the woman's face all that well. The baby's face is, you know, look like somebody threw it in flour, right? As opposed to low contrast, everything looks washed out and just overly gray. So we have to have some sort of balanced contrast. We have to meet somewhere in the middle. We have to have dynamic range, which is grayscale. And we also have to have contrast. We have to be able to see those differences in tissue type, or in this case, you know, I don't know, colors. So in radiography, what we're looking at are the difference between, and this really was whenever KVP controlled your contrast, but it's still valid as far as looking at the differences between high and low contrast. When we have low contrast, we can see a lot of different shades of gray. So back there, well, you can still kind of see them. These two kind of blend together, but what we can see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's almost no difference between these two, but you can't see them. There's 12 different shades of gray. As opposed to over here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is kind of graphic representation of everything that we've talked about in contrast. So high contrast means short grayscale, right? Low contrast is long grayscale, right? Latitude, also long grayscale. So, you know, we've got representation of a lot of different KVP levels. Again, this was back in screens and film days, but you can, again, see what it is that KVP used to do for us in our contrast, and why it is that for so long, and even up until now, we say KVP controlled contrast, or was a technical factor that controlled contrast, and this is why. As KVP goes up, we get penetration. So what you're looking at in these step wedges is at 40 kVp, you can penetrate through these low, the small end of the step wedge. But when you get up to the thicker portion of it, and a step wedge is just that, it's like a wedge-shaped thing, but it goes up, looks like stairs. And down here, we've got the thin end, so we got a lot of penetration, we got a lot of exposure to the image receptor, and all three of these steps, or all four of these steps, it looks like, kind of blend together. So we've really fundamentally got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 shades of gray, as opposed to this one, you can see differences all the way up, okay? So short grayscale, right? Short grayscale would be high contrast, low latitude. Long grayscale would be low contrast, high latitude, right? And then finally in an X-ray, and these really don't show very well on here, but you should be able to see them on your computer or phone. This whole thing is just gray. There is no real black and white there. It's just all gray, except for up here where it looks like you left a watch or something on the patient. As opposed to this one, we've got some truly darker areas and some truly lighter areas. So a higher contrast with a low KVP and a low contrast with a higher KVP. So how we manipulate contrast, we really don't. You can play with lookup tables, and you can hopefully maybe see some differences in contrast. Again, you know, I say this, and it's not just lip service. If you play with your computer or your X-ray machine in clinicals, it might help some of this stuff to kind of gel a little bit. Take something, you know, it doesn't have to be anything. There is a step wedge on the shelf back there. If you look on the second shelf from the top, you see the step wedge. Now you can check something like that out, but you could use a skull phantom, or you could take off a tennis shoe and take a picture of your tennis shoe, take an X-ray of your tennis shoe. Put it up there and take an X-ray and push the button that says hand or fingers, even still better yet. And make an exposure with that, and then leave it up there and use the computer algorithm, you know, push the button that says chest X-ray and see if you can see a difference between the two. Theoretically, you should, because again, what you're processing is under different computer algorithms, one for high contrast. You remember talking about the H&D curve on Wednesday, and we're going to talk about it again here in a bit, but one has a high contrast, which is a very vertical H&D curve assigned to that lookup table. And that will be the hand, and the chest X-ray would be very horizontal. So really, what the only way that we manipulate contrast in clinicals, truly in a clinical setting, is by selecting the exam type. You select an exam type for extremity work, you're going to get a high contrast image. If you select one for chest X-ray, you're going to get a much lower contrast image. You can also manipulate using differential absorption. with our computer algorithms now, you would probably have to use KVP levels outside of what your machine is capable of in order to truly see a dramatic difference between the two. But again, going back to what I was talking about in your playing with the machine in clinicals, you could set a KVP or set a chest X-ray technique, take a picture of your shoe, and then back that technique down, leave it on chest X-ray, but see if you can adjust your KVP and back it back down to 40, 50 KVP and see if you can see much of a difference between those two. Okay. And chances are you'll be able to see some, but it won't be as dramatic as chest X-ray versus hand. It's just not going to be that dramatic because your computer algorithm is probably going to even out those tissue density differences. All right, so how do we optimize our visibility reported detail? And again, we're talking about with VRD, that is your contrast essentially, and how you're dealing with scatter radiation primarily. All right, so you're going to use a proper KVP. It's not always going to be the highest KVP that you can get. If you shot everything at 110 KVP, you're going to have a lot of problems. You might start to see some loss of contrast. You're definitely going to introduce quantum model if you're shooting hands with 110 KVP, right? It's just going to over penetrate, and there's no sense to it. So you're going to use a proper KVP. You're going to use a grid when appropriate, and then you're going to use beam restriction, which is where we're going to spend the last portion of this semester, is really primarily in those things. Beam restriction being collimation, of course. So back to the H&D curve. When we're talking about the H&D curve, it's just graphing of those factors, and demonstrating, plotting the things, the characteristics of the image receptor system, like what we talked about before, speed, but primarily contrast, and the shoulder and toe portion of the curve showing where it is that we lose contrast because of overexposure or underexposure. So we have two axes. We've got a density axis and an exposure axis. And what we're really looking for as far as contrast goes is what we call average gradient. An average gradient is just the slope of the straight line portion of the H&D curve. So if we had a curve that was 45-degree angle, and we don't, but if we had the straight line portion that is 45-degree angle, what that would mean is that for every unit of exposure, image receptor exposure, or technique, increase in technique, we would get an accompanying exact change in our density or our exposure on our image receptor. In other words, you use one mass and you get this much exposure, right? That's one mass, and you get a resulting exposure that much. So if you double your mass, you get that much, and it likewise goes up that much. Does that make sense? And it goes up at a perfect 45-degree angle. Our image receptors and our processing is a little bit more sensitive than that, so that whenever we double our image receptor exposure, we get an increase in our perceived exposure at a greater rate. In other words, if you double your exposure to the image receptor, the density or your S number, your index number, should indicate that you got a greater than doubling response. Okay, so we're never going to have a H&D curve that the straight line portion is a 45-degree angle. It's going to be more vertical than that. It's going to appear higher contrast than that. All right, so it's just calculated if you ever run into a H&D curve question or average gradient, how it's calculated as rise over run. And what that means is you got 45-degree angle, that's rise, okay? Rise over run. So what that would mean is that you would divide division problem. Divide how high this goes by how far out it goes, okay? So if you're at 1, that means, 2 divided by 2 would be what? 1, right? So a 1 in our average gradient would be a 45-degree angle of the curve. So that's, rise over run is a calculation that you use in landscaping, roofing, glide ratio of airplanes. It's all essentially the same. So we'll go back to the H&D curve here. And again, this would be a very high contrast H&D curve. A low contrast for chest X-ray wouldn't be at 45-degree angle, at a 45-degree angle, but it would be more horizontal than this one. Okay. So what we're looking for again is shoulder portion. All the densities bleed together so that we lose contrast because it's too high of an exposure. And it can happen if you totally flood your image receptor. If your exposure gets too low, then again, you're going to lose contrast down here in the toe portion. So usually what we're talking about is the useful densities, and that's the straight line portion. Straight line portion tells us where our speed point is, and it also tells us what our contrast is, more importantly. So these are assigned, again, to your lookup tables. Your lookup tables are just too complicated to really understand exactly what's going on. These immediately you can look at. If it's like that, high contrast. If it's like that, it's lower contrast. All right, so latitude, talked about this. Inversely related to contrast, so high grayscale, long grayscale is high latitude. So as contrast goes up, latitude goes down. As latitude increases, contrast decreases. So grayscale follows latitude. Latitude and grayscale are really the same thing. As grayscale increases, latitude increases. You get more shades of gray, you have a longer grayscale, and you have higher latitude. So it's controlled in the technologist. The only thing that you can do to really affect that would be to do anything that you could do to either maximize or minimize scatter radiation and its effect on the image receptor. So how do you do that? Well, KVP primarily, right? So high KVP is often called a high latitude technique, and that's for 2 different reasons, really. One is high KVP is going to give you high latitude, right? But the other thing is that KVP controls your differential absorption. So we touched on this on Wednesday. You make an abdomen X-ray at 10 KVP, are you going to penetrate through the patient? So does it matter what mass value you use? It's never going to penetrate through the patient, so it's useless, right? That's also why KVP is the controlling factor for quality in the X-ray beam, right? Because that X-ray beam at 10 KVP is useless. It has no quality whatsoever. So can you make an X-ray of an abdomen with 10 KVP? And the answer is no. Can you make an X-ray of an abdomen with 150 KVP? Can you? Yeah. Are you going to get penetration through the patient? Yeah. Is it going to be ugly? Yeah. Should you ever? No. But can you? And the answer is yes. Okay, so you got a lot more latitude the higher the KVP goes up. You can make an exposure, especially with the computer algorithm control being the primary control of your contrast. You can make theoretically, you could make an exposure hands with 150 KVP. It's just not going to be pretty. Okay, so you have more latitude with KVP. To kind of narrow it in a little bit, let's say you make an exposure of an abdomen. We're just going to beat the abdomen to death. You make an exposure of an abdomen with just enough KVP to penetrate through the patient. Just enough. Just enough KVP to penetrate through the patient. Barely, but it does. All right, so you back your KVP down by 5 KVP, and what do you have? No X-ray, right? But you increase your KVP by 5, what do you have? You have an X-ray. You increase it by 10, what do you have? an x-ray. You increase it by 15, you have an x-ray, right? So you have more latitude with a higher KVP than what you do with lower KVP. At low KVP, not only theoretically can it affect your contrast and your grayscale, your latitude in the image itself, but it gives you more options. Latitude means option. If I say I'm going to give you a lot of latitude in clinicals, what does that mean? I'm not going to be looking over your shoulder every single x-ray you take, right? You got some latitude. So same thing here. You've got some freedom with a higher KVP technique than what you do with a lower KVP technique. Okay? So how does all this apply now? You know, it's magic. It's computer magic. Your CR and DR systems, it's all about your lookup table. Your lookup table is your stored histogram, and makes your image look like the stored image. So I kind of walked through this before, but you know, if you get a new imaging system, the applications guy is going to sit down with a radiologist, maybe a couple of radiologists, and maybe the lead tech or super user or whatever they call it now in the hospital. But they're going to look at every single exam type that you're going to shoot: fingers, hands, wrist, forearm, elbow, all the way up to the shoulder, skulls, abdomen, chest, everything. They're going to look at examples of every exam that you might shoot. And they're going to look at different images. So they'll look at some that are low contrast, some that are high contrast, and some that are in between. And the radiologist is going to look at each one of those and he's going to say, okay, for chest x-ray, this is what I want, low contrast. Right? For hands, maybe not quite that bad, but maybe if there was something in between them, right? For abdomen, this is what I'm going to want. So he's going to select, or they're going to select, out of this list of possible perfect images, they're going to pick what it is that they want to see. And that becomes your lookup table for that particular exam. So if you use the wrong KVP, you make a hand exposure using 70 KVP, is too high for a hand exposure, right? Where it would come out looking like that on screens and films, what it's going to do is it's going to take your image, and let's say, you know, your range of exposures are supposed to be like this, and because you use too high KVP, you got penetration that look more like this, and your range of exposures doesn't look like this, it looks like that, right? Well, you superimpose those two things, and what do you have? Do they match? The answer is no. So what it's going to do, let me pick the one that's not quite as busy. So the saved computer algorithm looks like this, yours looks like this, and what it's going to do is it's going to take yours and it's going to just kind of try to manipulate it. And it does it a whole lot faster than what I'm doing, so that they look almost identical as far as the contrast and density goes. Okay, that's the purpose for your computer algorithm, is to take, you know, your image and make it look like the saved image in as much as the contrast and density goes. So we used to control that with KVP and mass, and it's really controlled with lookup table. So is this a better system than controlling with KVP and mass? Absolutely it is. It is absolutely a better system. It cut back on radiation exposure to the patient eventually. Whenever we talked about screen speeds before, whenever we went to CR, you know, the dose went up to the patient, but once we went to DR, it went down dramatically in that respect. And then also fixed the slight subtle differences in density and contrast that we might have had to do a repeat on before. So, you know, it's doubling of a reduction in exposure to the patient. Is it always beneficial? And the answer is no. The reason for that is because people are lazy, right? People are lazy, and instead of learning techniques, what happens in a lot of cases is that people are relying on what they know in techniques is what they know is two things. One, in a computer system, garbage in equals garbage out, right? That's number one. Number two is that if you have too little signal, what do you get? Quantum model. You not only get quantum model, but in your H&D curve, if you underexpose, you fall into this area down here, and what do you lose? You lose density, you lose contrast, you lose signal, you get quantum model, and it gets bad. But look at how many different shades of gray, or how this straight line portion, how much latitude you have in there. This is a thin area, right? Let's say your ideal exposure falls right here, or even right here, let's say. You underexpose and you're going to fall down into here, but if you slightly overexpose, what do you get? Are you still in the sweet spot? Absolutely. So what do people do? Well, if I underexpose this patient, what's going to happen? I got to repeat. You know, computer's probably tracking how many repeats I'm going to get, right? Administration may come to me and say, well, you got a problem because you're repeating all these exams. So what are they going to do? Continue to shoot with low technique? Increase it a little bit. Maybe even increase it past what is ideal, intentionally. That's what we call dose creep. And that has been the danger of CR and DR systems, is that people get lazy and they don't take responsibility for learning the material, or learning their technique. And if they can slightly overexpose the patient, then the computer's going to fix it for them, right? So instead of using, ideal technique on hands, and let's say your ideal technique for an average hand is 3 mass, they may use 3.5 mass. Is that a big deal? Yeah, it kind of is. You're intentionally overexposing the patient. If in any other application, if you intentionally overdo some sort of physical contact with a patient or with a person, what do you call that? Assault, battery, right? Is there a correlation there? Yeah, absolutely is. Okay, so the lesson here is learn your techniques and apply them well, so that you don't intentionally overexpose the patient. Just doing that is just lazy. All right. So finally, we get to geometric factors, and geometric factors is the other half of this. So what we've been talking about are visibility functions. So in our image quality, we've essentially got two different things. We got visibility, and we got geometric factors. We've got sharpness of reported detail, which is your geometric factors, and you've got visibility of that reported detail. So we've got spatial resolution, geometric factors, and we've got contrast resolution. And we've done contrast resolution. Do we have any questions on contrast resolution? No? Okay, so geometric factors are all about lines and planes, distances, angles, and that sort of thing. So what we're going to talk about is magnification and everything that it brings with it. Distortion, the different types of distortion, and then focal spot blur. Okay, so magnification is considered a type of distortion. It decreases sharpness of reported detail, and that is because if we have the main way that we limit magnification is by having a low object to image distance. So if I put this thing close to this, this screen, then you can see a very clear outline, right? You've got good sharpness. The lines of this thing are very sharp. But if I bring it way out here, what does it look like? It's kind of fuzzy, right? So it's blurry, right? So we lose sharpness of reported detail, resolution, spatial resolution, with an increase in magnification. Increase in magnification regardless of whether it is because of an increase in OID or a decrease in SID. It doesn't really matter which one we go with. Both of them increase magnification. SID more so than what OID does. Not entirely, but because it's assumed that you're going to use the lowest possible OID, then the SID becomes the variable. All right, so it decreases sharpness of reported detail, and in sharpness we got two words to remember. One is umbra. Umbra is not used as much as penumbra, but it's umbra. Umbra means sharpness. Penumbra means unsharpness. Okay, so what you're probably going to see is more are more questions regarding penumbra. As we increase OID, then we get an increase in penumbra. Yeah. So if we increase OID and then we increase SID, we double our OID, then we double our SID, then what happens to our penumbra? Well, it stays the same. We'll talk about that here in a bit. So umbra is sharpness, penumbra is unsharpness, and it increases as SID decreases. So if all things remain the same, let's say you shoot a chest X-ray at 72 inches, then you've got a certain level of umbra versus penumbra. If you decrease your SID down to 40 inches, then what's going to happen? Why do we shoot a chest X-ray? Why do we prefer to shoot a chest X-ray at 72 inches? Decreased magnification. With the increase in magnification, we get an increase in penumbra, right? So if we decrease our SID, what happens to our magnification? It goes up. It goes up, right? It increases. So as we increase our magnification because of decrease in SID, then our penumbra goes up, right? Right. It also increases as OID increases. Now that's going to be controlled by a number of different things, primarily body position and the things that we've talked about before, but also body habitus and body thickness. All right. So you have a patient that you're shooting a chest X-ray on, and they're asthenic. How close to the image receptor is their heart going to be? Relatively close, right? You have somebody who's hypersthenic, and it's going to be at an increased distance, right? So maintaining that 72 inches is more important. Well, it's important on everybody, but it's more important on the hypersthenic patients because with an increase in body habitus from asthenic to hypersthenic, you get an increase in OID, and it becomes more important to increase your SID in order to compensate for that. But also object shape. All right. So object shape, we got a number of different things to consider in object shape. Okay. So if I have something that's very flat, like a piece of paper, I put it right up against the screen, how much magnification of that paper are we going to see? Not much. My hand, am I going to have magnification in my hand? Am I? What are we looking for in the hand? Primarily, what are we looking for? The bones, right? Are my bones right in contact? No. Right? So they've got some increase in OID. Is it significant? No, not really. What if I have something that's this thick? Am I going to have magnification? Yes. It's right up against the screen. Why would I have magnification if it's right up against the screen? Only part of it is, right? It's not paper thin, it's fat, right? It's thick. So you're going to have an increase in OID. So, the thickness is going to be an issue, but also the shape as well. So I've got this thing. How would you describe the shape of this thing?
Cylinder.
It's a cylinder, right? So what's the fattest part of the cylinder? Right in the middle of it, right? So is there any way for me to get the fattest part of that closest to the image receptor? The answer is no. So if you have something that's round, cylindrical in shape, or even better still, spherical in shape, you're always going to have an increase in OID. With an increase in OID, you're going to have an increase in magnification, which is going to give you an increase in penumbra. Right. So, what are we going through in positioning right now? Just in general. The head, right. So what's the fattest part of your head? Pretty much right at the parietal bones, right? So how do you get that closest to the image receptor in a frontal view? You're going to have an increase in OID, which is going to give you an increase in magnification, which is going to give you an increase in penumbra, right? Okay. Also, though, you can kind of use body position to overcome some differences in body in object shape. So we talked about this in the last semester, and I told you, straight up, I have no idea why we do this, but we've got bones in our body that they follow the divergence of the central ray. What I mean by that is your central ray comes out of your x-ray tube and it spreads out, right? So we've got different anatomy that would naturally follow that. So it's basically a V shape, right? Or pyramidal shape. So if we can place the anatomy, those types of anatomy, where they are most parallel to the central ray, then we're going to have a decrease in magnification as opposed to if we put them that way. Does that make sense? Okay. Can you remember from last semester an anatomy that we talked about that does this, that has a shape that parallels the central ray, and we would be better shooting in one particular projection, but we don't. Wrist bones, very good. It's the wrist bones, exactly. So we shoot the wrist bones PA, but the wrist bones are shaped like this, with this being the anterior portion, right? So we image the wrist bones like so. Why do we do that? Again, I can't tell you. What are the steps to positioning wrists? Yeah, bend the fingers up to push that, the anterior portion down, otherwise you're going to have an increase in OID, right? You flip it around like that, are you going to have that issue as well? No, it's just going to lay flat on the image receptor. Now, what is 130 years worth of x-ray imaging? We do wrist PA. For the life of me, I can't figure out why, but we do. All right, so object shape, object position, body habitus, body thickness all go into increases in magnification. So there are two different ways to calculate magnification. We're just going to touch on this and then we'll dismiss because Trent's going to get going. So two different ways to calculate magnification. And these, never mind. Two different ways. Magnification factor is what MF stands for, and it can be calculated as image size over object size, or it can be calculated as SID over SOD. Now, what is SOD? Subject to object distance, right. Now, when you get a question and you have to calculate using SID and SOD, here's what you're going to have a tendency to do, all right? You're going to have a tendency to go SID over OID or something like that. So how do you calculate SOD? SID minus OID, right? So if you ever see a magnification factor calculation where you have to calculate using SID and SOD, you'll probably be given SID and OID, but what you're going to have to do is subtract OID from SID to get SOD and divide that into SID, okay? So your magnification factor is always going to be greater than 1, okay? So if you have magnification factor, again, there is nothing that you're going to be putting directly onto the image receptor. I used a hand before, right? Your hand, you can't put the bones directly on the image receptor, so you're going to have magnification of those fingers and of the hand and wrist bones. It's going to be there. It's going to be minute. But your magnification, the size of your image is going to be slightly larger than the size of the object. So the magnification may be only 1%. So your magnification factor may be 1.01. That 0.1 represents the actual amount of magnification. That 1 represents the size of the image. Okay, if you have 100% of something, then what do you have? If I gave you all of that, how much of that would you have? All of it, which is 100%, right? So how many of that do you have? 1. 100% is 1, right? So that 1 means 100%. You're never going to have a magnification factor that does not have that 1 in front of it. It's always going to be 1.0 something, or you know, if it's very dramatic, it may be a whole number, or not a whole number. If it's very dramatic, it may be 2. But it's always going to be greater than 1, regardless of what it is. All right? It's got to be pretty dramatic to be 2, but it's always going to be greater than 1. Okay? So how we control that is with SID and OID. We want to use as low an OID as possible and as practical of an SID as possible. So 40 inches is okay for a lot of things. It would be impractical to shoot everything 72 inches. You couldn't get the height in most rooms to get 72 inches for table exams. You'd have to put the patient down in a hole just to reach the tube. Okay? So any questions? No? All right. Y'all have a good weekend. We'll pick up there on